Welcome to PSHS 6240, Week 5 here at George Washington University's Homeland Security Master's Program. As usual, just want to start off with announcements. Adobe Connect session will be this 8 February at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Group 2 is in the chute. So again, same rules apply. Get your PowerPoint in before. Same link as we used before, so you have that. And about 25 minutes for briefing, 5 to 10 minutes for questions and clear up any issues. So again, that's this Thursday. Knock on wood, government shutdown or no, I don't know how that's going to happen, but at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So paper 2 is due that Sunday at 11:59 on 11 February. And again, I don't want to get excuses on 11 February at 11:50 that you can't get it done. So keep that in mind. So current events. I don't know. Again, it's unfortunate that I never wanted this class to become political, but again, as always, politics intrudes on this class. And if you guys have been watching the news, this classified memo about FBI contacts and politicization was released, and I think I'll let you think of what you want to think of that. But I had a conversation with my dad a couple of days ago, who's not in the government and not in our line of work, and he asked a question. He said, "How come classified information seems to get released a lot? But there's a lot of information out there that people would like to know, but doesn't get put out. It only seems to be classified by the government, where there's legal authorities, that this information gets leaked out." And he brought the example, that a certain president's tax returns. There's about 50 people who know his tax returns, from the people at the IRS and the auditors and the IT folks who can access that. And there's a hell of a lot of interest in those tax returns, but there's no disclosure of information. Medical, everyone would love to know the medical histories on celebrities. There's probably a lot of desire and a lot of money out there if you can hack into, or you can release some famous person's medical records or their mental health records. But we never see those. Very rarely does that get disclosed. And how come, again, hospitals and the IRS and other agencies are so good at keeping information, but information that seems to get classified gets released all the time? And my dad asked that. I didn't have an answer for him. And he even brought up business strategies. Business strategies are very sensitive information, and businesses do a good job of keeping information to themselves. There's very rarely large data dumps on private businesses, but our government seems to not be able to hold classified information very well. Why is that? I don't know. That's something for you guys to think about as we move forward in this class, and as you move forward in your careers. So paper, everyone has their grades back for paper 1, and I think we need some work. How you write as you progress in your careers is going to be the most important thing. How you write and how you present. And that's why I emphasize those skills in this course. How it works is you write a paper, it builds interest, and that paper gets sent up the chain of command, and now you're noticed well because you wrote this paper. That's how you have to approach your writing. What I came across on a lot of the papers is nothing of the sort. Far too much background was the biggest thing. I said this multiple times. I don't want history. I don't want history lessons. I don't want that type of issue. I know the history. I assign these courses because I know, or assign these subjects because I know the history. I know the definitions of terrorism. You have to write to interest me. As someone who's engaged in these issues, you have to be original enough and you have to be analytical enough that I can look back and say, wow, this is something that has interested me. I've been captivated by this paper. If you start out with history, you're going to lose my interest. Please don't give me background. And I can tell if you're trying to fill the 1,500 word minimum for these papers. I can tell that. And that is a huge pet peeve for me, because that tells me you did not think through the lectures, or you didn't take notes of the lectures, you didn't think through with your classmates when you're on the discussion boards. And if you try and fill it up, I'll notice, and I'll just leave it at that. Don't repeat the definitions of terrorism. Some of you just went ahead and repeated every single definition from 8 agencies and international definitions. I can tell that's filler. Don't do that. I can understand if you want to use one definition or you want to do a compare and contrast, but if you just list out the definitions, you haven't done anything for me. You have wasted my time. So the 4 criteria, a lot of people went back to those 4 criteria that I use for terrorism, for state, non-state actor, civilian, that has a political narrative. And a lot of you said that's the definition of terrorism. But I specifically emphasized in the lecture each one of those 4 points there was a problem with on how we caveat terrorist acts. So to take that as gospel and start your paper with that and try and use that as your underpinning criteria, I think you've went awry unless you've somehow addressed those issues that I talked about in the lecture. And then passive voice, always an issue. I know this is going to sound like your remedial grammar lesson back in high school, but this top sentence is passive. The ball was bounced by the boy. The boy is the subject of the sentence. Bounced is the verb of the subject of the sentence. Ball is the direct object. The subject, your sentence should be like this: subject, verb, direct object. And I do it for my papers. I still do this, having been in this business for 20 years. I still go through my readings and I still do it like I'm in 8th grade, where you say subject, verb, direct object, indirect object after you've or while you're proofreading. I know that sounds again 8th grade-ish, but I still do that so I can avoid passive voice. Please do that in your papers from going forward. So week 4 review. So I want to throw this question out, and I actually, when I taped the lecture in your thing, ISIS was just being successful, or ISIS was on its ascent. But I want to throw this question: will ISIS be successful? I think not. I think ISIS will follow along those lines, dustbin of history lines. And again, because they've lacked a stable financial source, they've lacked a stable level of recruiting. I think they sacrificed flash in the pan short-term gains for long-term strategy. Now, I could be wrong. ISIS might be an insurgency that goes, through our lifetimes. But right now, I don't think, and again, how I outlined it in my lecture, I think ISIS has followed the path of becoming irrelevant because of, again, their own brutality and their lack of funding and their lack of their inability to go from a violent narrative to a political narrative. But I'll let you decide. Again, what are the variables? And those are the variables I talked to, those what makes something successful, what doesn't. And again, I think a lot of you analyzed it pretty well, why Hezbollah was successful. Well, most of you analyzed that Hezbollah was successful, and one of the reasons was stable financing. The other reason is they were able to establish a political dynamic in Lebanon that ISIS or Jamaat Islamiyah or any of those other groups that failed were not able to. And those are the variables. And I think the Hezbollah argument and the IRA argument the key variable is outside funding. Hezbollah had Iranian funding no matter what. They had millions of dollars coming in. The IRA had a massive exterior from expatriates and from other groups funding operation that they did not have to resort to criminal activity on the same level as maybe those other groups that we talked about. Incidentally, the IRA's great fundraising was here in the United States in the 1970s and 1980s. And then for ISIS, are we seeing the schism? And that schism is when leaders, the more politically oriented leaders, either become successful or die, get killed in the group. And are we seeing that schism point with ISIS? And that I ask you to think about that for other groups as well. And then finally, WMD terrorism. Again, this is what your paper is on, so I want to continue with this theme. So the movie Dirty War, great movie. I think it was realistic on certain points. The parts that aren't realistic are the acquisition of radiological weapons, which you will talk about in your paper. I think they kind of just blew over that. Just FYI, to acquire the dirty bombs that can cause the damage that you saw requires some sort of let's just say you wouldn't find that in medical or industrial capabilities. You need to weaponize it in some way, and they kind of gloss over that issue a little bit. But other than how they do the tracking, briefing before Congress or Parliament, in that case, I think is very accurate. And then the other thing, from a first responder perspective, I hope you saw the importance of getting a common operating picture, those who are in the military, where you know what the hot zone is and what the secondary zone is and what are the contaminated zones and where the exit points are and where the medical issues are. You saw a little bit of struggle in the movie. So just that's a very important part for disaster management, getting a common operating picture. And then someone said when I saw this movie many years ago that if it was realistic, you wouldn't enclose everyone like they did in Dirty War and have only decontamination on certain areas. You would just tell people to go home and wash themselves. That's better than keeping everyone at certain exit points, contaminating each other, with wounds and those types of issues. So that part, I don't know. Something to consider if you're ever in the emergency management for WMD radiological bombs. Shinrikyo, again, you saw the case study for Shinrikyo. As you saw it, and as I outlined in the lecture, and as you answered your question, had certain variables leading to success that other terrorist groups did not, to include massive amounts of resources. The video talked about $1 billion, $100 million on the low end, but it's a lot of money to play with. They had access to some of the best scientific minds in Japan. Their target wasn't very far away, right? You can't imagine, or Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula or any other Al-Qaeda or ISIS, they would have to develop any device in their own backyard and transport it many miles to where their target is. Shinrikyo did not have that problem. And then finally, Satyan 7, which is where they developed the sarin, operating right out in the open. You can't imagine ISIS, Al-Qaeda, or even a right-wing extremist group in the United States operating a facility like that with such impunity in the U.S. So that's something to consider going forward for your paper. And then you had the Rajneesh case study that you saw the video on, and I just wanted to put that out there, that it's not just Al-Qaeda, it's not just Islamic extremists or terrorists, that certain groups can engage in this type of violence that are cultish or in that nature. So again, I just want to emphasize this week you'll be doing paper 2. I intend this to be, again, for those writing the paper, short, concise papers, 1,500 words. If it's 1,501 words, don't hand it to me. So 1,500 words is the max, excluding the cover page and the bibliography. Again, designed to be concise, just like in the real world, a short paper that people can get to the understanding of quickly. I don't want you to do huge amounts of research. Again, you have the 3 topics that I've assigned. They shouldn't take more than a couple of hours of research background. I'm not trying to. You don't need to get down to the. You do need to talk science, but you don't need to. But you do need to. You do need to talk about science, but don't get into the molecular level. And then you can see the threat scenarios here. And then the question is this a threat? Why or why not? And then focus on these 3 issues: production, transportation, and dissemination. Those 3 issues for each one of these scenarios that you see in front of you. So if there's questions on the paper, please let me know. Don't wait till the last minute. I recommend you do some of the research and then you come prepared on Thursday to talk about it at the time. So week 5 preview. Again, I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but this is counterterrorism strategy. And here's some of the articles that I want you to hit the top line. The PBS Frontline is an excellent, excellent documentary. And then you see the discussions are going to focus on U.S. counterterrorism strategy and Israeli counterterrorism strategy. So I appreciate your efforts, and I look forward to Thursday.